On a Thursday morning in February of 1998, on a logging road carved into the side of the Bitterroot Mountains in western Montana, a man named Wade Renner stood on a slope of 22 degrees and understood for the first time in his career that he was going to lose. He did not say it out loud. Men like Wade did not say such things out loud. He just stood there in the cold with his boots planted sideways against the grade, watching the most expensive machine he had ever owned slide an inch to the left on frozen mud, and then another inch, and he felt something in his chest go quiet and heavy. Below him, the valley was white and silent. Above him, the wreck waited. And somewhere down the mountain, the most expensive machine ever to climb into these hills had just been beaten by a hill that did not even have a name on the map. 3 days earlier, a fully loaded Kenworth logging truck had been hauling 65 tons of Douglas fir timber down off a clear cut on Lolo Ridge. The driver was a young man named Travis Beck, 29 years old, who had run this road 200 times and trusted it the way you trust a thing you have survived. That trust was the problem. Under a thin skin of fresh snow, the road held a patch of black ice, and ice does not care how many times you have survived. The rear tandems broke loose first. Travis felt the back of the rig step out from under him, the way a horse steps sideways slow, and then all at once. He turned into it. He did everything right. It did not matter. 65 tons of truck and timber jackknifed across the road, and the whole rig slid off the shoulder and buried itself on a slope so steep that a man could barely keep his footing walking near it. Travis climbed out through the window with his hands shaking and his nose bleeding and one thought hammering in his skull. The truck was not the company's. The truck was his. He had signed the papers 11 months ago at a bank in Hamilton, with his wife sitting beside him and a baby ewe in the spring, and he had driven off the lot believing he had finally bought his family a future. Every dollar he had, every dollar he was going to have, was sitting in that machine with its rear axles buried in frozen Montana mud and its load of logs still chained to the bed. For 3 days he had not gone home. He slept in his pickup at the bottom of the access road with the heater running and the radio off, and every morning he walked up the grade to look at his truck lying on its side like a dead animal. And every morning he walked back down without a word. His wife had called the logging office twice asking if he was all right, and both times he had told the foreman to tell her he was fine because he could not make himself say it to her in his own voice. The first night he had done the math in his head, over and over, the loan and the insurance, and what a salvage company would pay for 65 tons of timber and a frame that would never run true again, and the numbers always came out the same way. The numbers came out as a man who had bet his family's future on a road he trusted and lost. The second night he had stopped doing the math because the math was a kind of cruelty he could not keep doing to himself. The third night he just sat in the dark with the heater ticking and watched his own breath fog the windshield and waited for Monday when a man with a clipboard would come and make it official. The men on the site had stopped trying to talk to him. There was nothing to say to a man watching the only thing he owned die slowly on a mountainside. That was who had called Wade Renner. Wade owned High Divide Recovery, and he owned it the way a proud man owns the thing that defines him. His company motto was painted on the door of every truck he ran: no load too heavy, no recovery too tough. He had built that motto over 20 years, one impossible job at a time, starting with a single second-hand tow truck and a willingness to drive into storms other men turned away from, and he believed it the way other men believe in Scripture. So when the call came in about a buried Kenworth on Lolo Ridge, Wade brought the pride of his fleet, a rotator wrecker. $400,000 of computerized hydraulic power capable of lifting 55 tons under perfect conditions, the kind of machine that made other operators go quiet when it rolled onto a site. He had taken a loan against his house to buy it the year before, and he had not told his wife how big the loan was, and every job that machine pulled was a payment he did not have to sweat at the end of the month. But these were not perfect conditions. The ground on that slope was frozen mud over loose rock, and the rotator needed solid footing the way a man needs solid footing to throw a punch. Its outriggers had to plant on 4 points and brace the whole machine before the boom could do anything at all. Every time Wade's operator extended them, the steel feet found nothing under the mud but rolling stone, and the whole 35,000-pound machine began to creep sideways down the grade, slow and patient and terrifying. 6 hours. 6 hours they fought that slope. And then Wade's operator, a careful man named Hollis, who had run iron for Wade for 9 years and did not scare easy, climbed down out of the cab and shook his head. Boss Hollis said, "If I set up on that grade, we are going over the side." This machine was not built for a mountain logging road. It was built for a highway. "Try it from the other side," Wade said, "closer to the trees." "I tried it from the other side an hour ago. You saw me try it." Hollis wiped his face with the back of a glove. "I have got 2 kids, Wade. I will do near about anything you ask me. I will not drive your machine off a cliff to save a truck that is already wrecked." Wade looked at him a long moment, and the worst part was that he could not argue because he had watched it himself, and a part of him had been relieved when Hollis quit before he had to be the one to call it. "All right," Wade said quietly. "All right, get clear of it." Hollis climbed down, and the two of them stood in the cold looking at the machine that was supposed to be the answer to every question a mountain could ask. Wade had bought that machine, believing it would mean he never again had to look a man in the eye and say, "It cannot be done." That was what the $400,000 was supposed to buy. Not the hydraulics, not the computer, not the lift rating on the spec sheet. The thing it was supposed to buy was the right to keep his motto. And here he was on the 3rd day looking at the most capable machine in 3 counties, about to break his motto across his knee in front of his own crew. "You did right," Wade told Hollis, because the man had 2 kids and deserved to hear it. "I would not have driven it off the side either. The machine is not wrong. The mountain is just wrong for the machine. There is a difference, and I am only now starting to see it." Hollis nodded, grateful, and went to get coffee, and Wade stood alone with the rotator in the failing afternoon. He called 3 other recovery outfits. All 3 drove up the mountain, looked at the slope, and turned around in the road. Too steep. Ground too soft. You would have to anchor to bedrock, and there is 6 feet of overburden sitting on top of the bedrock. It cannot be done. The third man to drive away was a competitor named Kurt Lang. Kurt and Wade had hated each other for 15 years. The quiet professional hatred of 2 men who bid against each other for the same work in the same county, who had undercut each other and poached each other's drivers and shaken hands at the same funerals. Kurt did not even get out of his truck. He rolled down his window, looked up the slope at the buried Kenworth and at Wade's idle rotator, and he smiled the smile of a man who has just watched his rival fail at the one thing he brags about. "No load too heavy, huh?" Kurt said. "You drove all the way up here to read my door, Kurt." "Oh, damn. I drove up here for the same job you did. Difference is I had the sense to look at it and leave." Kurt let his eyes travel over the rotator, slow, enjoying it. Big machine. Real big machine. Must be a comfort making those payments and watching it sit. Then he keyed the radio in his truck, the open channel that every logging crew and tow operator in the valley monitored, and he said it loud enough for the whole mountain to hear. High Divide is up here on Lolo Ridge with a $400,000 machine, and they cannot move a stuck log truck. Anybody wants a good laugh, drive on up. And he drove away, and the radio crackled, and somewhere down in the valley men were laughing. Wade stood in the cold and felt his own motto turn to ash in his mouth. He thought about the loan against his house. He thought about every operator in 3 counties hearing those words over their coffee. He thought for one ugly second that Kurt Lang was right, and the thought made him want to put his fist through something. There was a man waiting at the bottom of the access road who made it worse. His name was Glenn Forsythe, and he was the insurance adjuster, and he had arrived 2 days early because he had already decided how this was going to end. Glenn was a tidy man in a clean coat who had never once in his life had frozen mud on his boots. He carried a clipboard the way some men carry a weapon. "I have seen enough of these," Glenn said to Wade, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "Monday I write it up as a total loss. The salvage value of the timber covers part of it. The truck is gone." He looked at the rotator. He looked at Wade. "I pay for results, Mr. Renner. I do not pay for effort. You will build a logging company for your time, I am sure, and that is between you and them, but do not expect my company to make up the difference because a job could not be done. A job that cannot be done is not a tragedy, it is a number." "There is a man up here who owns that truck," Wade said. "It is not a number to him." Glenn looked at him with something close to pity. "It is always a number to somebody, Mr. Renner. My job is to be the one who says it out loud." The logging company was losing $15,000 a day on missed deliveries. The contract that kept 40 men employed through the winter was bleeding out on a mountainside. And Wade Renner, whose truck said no recovery too tough, was about to drive down off Lolo Ridge, having proved his own motto a lie in front of his worst enemy and a man with a clipboard. That was when the problem became clear to him, the real problem, the one he had been refusing to look at for 2 days. The problem was not the truck. The problem had never been the truck. The problem was the mountain. 20 miles away in the barn outside the small town of Florence, an old man was running a rag across the hood of a machine that had not turned a wheel in 3 years. His name was Earl Halvorsen, and he was 76 years old. The barn was cold enough to see your breath in, and Earl did not light the stove, because lighting the stove for one old man and one dead machine felt like a kind of lie. He just worked the rag across the long boxy hood in the gray light coming through the dusty window, the way he had done 100 times since they parked her, clearing dust off a thing that was not going anywhere. The machine under the rag was a 1947 Diamond T 969, and even sitting still in a dark barn, she did not look like anything else on earth. The cab was square and angular and stripped to the bone military steel, built without an ounce of comfort or apology. The boom rose behind the cab as a tall, vertical tower of welded I-beams, the kind of thing nobody made anymore, because nobody fought wars with trucks like this anymore. Under the faded red paint in the worn places along the fenders, you could still see the old color underneath. Olive drab, army green, the color of a thing built to do hard work in terrible places. Earl looked at the dust on his rag, and then he looked at his own hands, and he understood that he and the machine were the same kind of thing now, built for hard work, parked in the dark, started up twice a year just to prove the heart still turned over. He had walked out to this barn most mornings of the last 3 years, and most mornings he did not know exactly why. Sometimes he told himself he was checking on her the way you check on an animal in a hard winter. Sometimes he ran the rag over her, and sometimes he just stood in the cold and looked at her, the long hood and the welded tower and the green ghost of the army coming up through the red, and he felt something he did not have a clean word for. It was the feeling of standing in front of a thing that still knew what it was for, in a world that had quietly decided it was no longer needed. He knew that feeling from the inside. He had been living in it. The spring before, on an ordinary morning, Earl had felt an iron band tighten across his chest while he was carrying firewood, and he had set the wood down very carefully and sat on the porch step until it passed. The doctors in Missoula gave it a name and gave him a bottle of pills and a long list of things he was no longer allowed to do. His grandson had driven up from Hamilton. The family had gathered in the kitchen the way families gather, and they had used soft voices, and they had agreed, all of them, around him and over him, and for him, that Earl Halvorsen was done. He had not argued. There did not seem to be any point. A man does not argue with his own heart. But he had sat at that kitchen table with his daughter-in-law's hand on his arm, and his grandson trying not to cry, and he had felt something worse than the iron band across his chest. He had felt himself become a thing that other people discussed in soft voices. A man who had spent 55 years being the one who solved the problem had become the problem, the thing to be managed, the old-timer to be kept comfortable and out of the way. He had nodded and let them have it because it was easier than the fight, and he had been quietly dying of it ever since, a little more each morning, in a way no doctor had a pill for. Earl had started cutting timber in these mountains in 1943, a boy of 21 setting chokers in old-growth forest, while the war ate up every board foot the country could produce. He had spent 55 years moving heavy things across steep ground, and somewhere in those 55 years, he had learned things about weight and slope and friction that no engineer with a degree had ever learned, because engineers learned from books, and Earl had learned from the days the books were wrong. Now he learned things from a kitchen radio. He kept a scanner on the workbench, an old habit, the way some men keep a dog. It muttered to itself all morning about weather and elk and the price of fuel. And on this Thursday morning, it began to mutter about a stuck Kenworth on Lolo Ridge and a recovery company that could not move it, and a man named Wade Renner who kept telling the logging supervisor, in a voice getting flatter and flatter, that the slope was too steep and the physics did not work, and nothing on this earth could pull on that grade. Earl set down the rag. He knew that slope. He had pulled trucks off grades steeper than Lolo Ridge back in the 50s and 60s, when the logging roads up here were nothing but bulldozer cuts, gouged into the mountainside, no shoulder, no gravel, just a scratch on a cliff. He had been up on Lolo Ridge itself more than once in weather worse than this, and he knew something that Wade Renner, standing on that grade, did not know and could not know, because Wade had never had a reason to learn it. The Diamond T had not been built for American highways. She had been built for something far worse than a Montana logging road. But knowing a thing and doing a thing are two different animals, and in the coal barn, Earl Halvorsen felt the second animal stir, and it had teeth. He was 76. He had a heart that had already warned him once. He had a family that had buried his career in a kitchen with soft voices, and the machine had not moved in 3 years. If he drove up that mountain and the machine failed, or his heart failed, or his hands failed, he would not just lose. He would lose in front of the whole valley, an old fool with an old truck proving every soft voice in that kitchen right. They would not even be angry with him. That was the part that frightened him most. They would be gentle. They would say they understood. And they would never again look at him as anything but a man who had to be watched. The fear of that was real and cold, and it sat in his chest right next to the heart they had warned him about. He stood in the barn a long moment, an old man between a dead machine and an open door. Outside the window, the light on the snow was the flat gray light of a winter that did not care one way or the other what an old man decided. Then he walked to the workbench and picked up the telephone, because somewhere on Lolo Ridge, a young man he had never met was sleeping in a pickup beside the only thing he owned. And Earl Halvorsen had never in 55 years been able to leave a man stuck on a mountain, and he was not going to learn how to start now just because a doctor had handed him a list. Tamarack Timber, this is Roy Maddox. Roy, my name is Earl Halvorsen. I logged these hills for 55 years. I heard you got a Kenworth down on Lolo Ridge. A pause on the line. We do. It is bad, Earl. Nobody can pull it. Renner's people, 3 other outfits. Grade is too steep. I think I can pull it. A longer pause. Earl could hear the wind on the other end of the line up on the ridge. Earl knew Roy said carefully, High Divide has been up here 2 days with a $400,000 machine. I know it. I have a wrecker. She is old, Army surplus, 1947. But she was built for mountain work, Roy. Built for exactly this. I would like to bring her up. There was the sound of a man making a decision he could not justify and was going to make anyway. Roy Maddox had grown up in these mountains. He had heard the name Halvorsen his whole life the way you hear the name of a thing that was already old when you were young. Come on up, Roy Maddox said. We have got nothing left to lose. Earl hung up the phone. He stood there a moment with his hand still on it. Then he went and pulled the big barn doors open, and the gray daylight fell across the Diamond T for the first time in a long time. And he climbed up into the cold cab and worked the starter. And after a moment, the old engine coughed and caught and settled into the low grinding idle he had known since he was a boy. He sat there and let her warm, and he did not call his grandson, and he did not call his daughter-in-law, because he knew exactly what they would say, and he was too old and had too little time left to spend any of it being talked out of the last thing that made him feel alive. It takes a 1947 Diamond T about 2 hours to climb a mountain when she has been asleep for 3 years. She came grinding up the access road in first gear at no more than 8 miles an hour, and the sound of her arrived before she did a deep, slow grinding pull that did not sound like any modern engine. And every man on the logging site stopped what he was doing and turned to look. What came around the bend made some of them laugh and some of them go quiet. She was massive and ancient and absolutely without shame. The square cab, the bare steel, the tall welded tower of the boom, the olive drab bleeding up through the faded red. She looked like something that had driven straight out of an old newsreel and gotten lost for 50 years on its way home. She looked like war. But it was not only the men who had laughed at Kurt Lang's joke who fell silent. There were older hands on that crew, 2 or 3 of them, men in their 60s, who had grown up around equipment like this when it was still common in the back country, and they did not laugh at all. One of them, a faller named Pruitt, who was no relation to Danny, took the unlit cigarette out of his mouth and held it and watched her come up the grade in that low, unhurried gear, and said to no one in particular, in a voice the younger men had never heard him use, that he had not seen one of those run in 30 years, and he had forgotten what the sound of one did to a man. The young men looked at him and did not understand. They would understand by the end of the day. Wade Renner stood with his crew at the bottom of the grade and watched her come, and after the first shock, he started to laugh because laughing was better than the thing underneath the laughing. Tell me that is not what I think it is, Wade said. One of the logging hands nodded slowly. That is Earl Halvorsen's rig. He has had it forever. His daddy bought it off the army. That relic, Wade said, is not going to make it up the access road, let alone pull 65 tons uphill on a 22-degree grade. He shook his head and the laugh went out of him, and what was left underneath was bitter. I have got a $400,000 machine sitting idle, and they sent me a museum piece. This is what it has come to. Kurt Lang on the radio and a man older than my father coming to fix what I could not. The Diamond T rolled to a stop and idled low and patient, and the door of the cab opened, and an old man climbed down. He came down slow, not weak but careful, the deliberate care of a man whose knees hold the memory of 55 years of mountain ground and consult that memory before every step. He was tall and lean and weathered, with hands that looked like they had been carved out of the same wood he had spent his life cutting. He stood beside his machine and looked up the slope at the buried Kenworth, and he did not say anything, and somehow the not saying anything made the laughing men stop laughing. Wade walked over. "You must be Earl." "I am. Wade Renner, High Divide Recovery." Wade put out his hand and Earl took it, and Wade felt the strength still in the old grip and was surprised by it. "Roy says you think you can pull that Kenworth." "I know I can." Wade let go of the hand. He gestured up the slope at the wreck at his own beautiful idle rotator. He kept his voice friendly, the way a man keeps his voice friendly when he is about to be cruel and wants to pretend he is not. "Earl, with respect, that truck of yours is from 1947. I have got a machine right there that cost $400,000, and it cannot get a grip on that slope. What in the world makes you think that old thing can do something mine cannot?" And there it was, right in the soft place. The exact words the soft voices in the kitchen had used. That old thing, done, past it. Earl felt the words land. He felt the fear rise up to meet them, the cold animal in his chest. For one moment in front of all of them, the 76-year-old man wondered if the laughing men were right, wondered if he had driven 20 miles to do nothing but hand the whole valley the proof that he belonged in a kitchen with a blanket over his knees. He did not let it show. He had spent 55 years not letting things show. He turned his head and looked at his machine for a moment, and his hand came to rest on the cold steel of her fender, the way a man rests a hand on the neck of a horse he trusts, and when he looked back at Wade, his face was calm. "Your machine has to brace before it can pull," Earl said. "It throws its weight out sideways onto those 4 feet, and on that slope there is nothing under the mud to push against. So it slides." He said it plainly, no triumph in it. "Mine does not brace. Mine puts all her weight straight down over the rear, and she pulls slow. That is the whole difference." Before Wade could answer, another man walked over. He was young, maybe 35, one of Wade's operators, and his name was Danny Pruitt. And he carried a clipboard of his own, though his was full of numbers instead of insurance forms. Danny had gone to a 2-year program for heavy equipment operation, and he believed in numbers the way Earl believed in slopes completely, and he had heard enough. "Sir," Danny said to Earl, polite and certain and condescending, "all at once, the load calculations do not work. That Kenworth is sitting on a 22-degree grade. The second you put uphill tension on it, the vector forces are going to pull your truck up the slope right along with it. You will lose your own traction and you will slide. It is not an opinion, it is physics. The whole site was listening now. Travis Beck had come up from his pickup and stood at the edge of the crowd, hollow-eyed, watching the old man who said he could save the only thing he owned. Earl looked at the young man with the numbers, and he was not angry, and that was the strange thing. The thing that made Danny falter a little. The old man just looked tired in a patient kind of way, the way you look at something you have explained many times to many young men over many years. "The Army used these to pull Sherman tanks," Earl said quietly. "Italy, 1944. Up roads steeper than this one with the shells coming in. 30-ton tanks up the mountains." He paused. "They knew about your vector forces, son. They knew about them better than your school did. That is why she is geared the way she is geared and why her weight sits where it sits. The men who built her solved your problem 50 years before you learned the words for it." Danny opened his mouth and closed it again. Wade Renner looked at the old man, and for the first time something flickered behind his eyes that was not laughter. But pride is a hard thing to put down once you have carried it a long way, and Kurt Lang's voice was still crackling somewhere in the back of his skull, and the man with the clipboard was still watching, and Wade was not ready. Earl, he said, I appreciate the history, I do, but I can't let you take that machine up onto that grade. If you go over the side that is a man's life, my own insurance would not even cover me standing here watching you try it. That was when Roy Maddox stepped in. Roy was the logging supervisor, a broad, quiet man who had spent his life around equipment and around the men who ran it, and he had been watching the old man's face during all of it, and he had seen something there the others had missed. Wade, Roy said, let him try. Roy, if that thing goes off the mountain, that is on all of us. If it goes off the mountain, then it goes off the mountain. Roy looked at the buried Kenworth, at the young driver, standing hollow-eyed at the edge of the crowd, at the 40 men whose winter depended on a contract that was bleeding out by the hour. But this man worked these mountains longer than you have been alive, Wade. My father knew his father. There is not a slope in this range a Halvorsen has not pulled something off of. If Earl Halvorsen says he can do it, I believe him. And we have got nothing left to lose that we have not already lost. Wade Renner stood there a long moment, caught between two kinds of failure. He looked at the old man. He looked at the relic idling in the cold. He looked at his own beautiful $400,000 machine sitting useless on the grade, the machine that carried his motto on its door and his house on its title. Fine, Wade said at last. And then, because pride does not die easy, because a proud man has to leave himself one door to walk out of, he added the cruelest thing he would ever say, and he would spend years being ashamed of it. But I am recording this. He pulled a camcorder from the cab of his truck and raised it. When that Diamond T slides off the mountain, I want it on tape that it was not my company that put it there. Earl looked at the little black camera pointed at him like an accusation. He looked at the old man's worst nightmare made real, the whole valley about to watch him fail, the failure preserved on tape so it could be watched again and again. Fair enough, he said. And the strangest thing happened inside him as he said it. The fear did not get bigger, it got smaller, because there was nothing left to be afraid of now. The worst thing, the public failure, the proof that the soft voices were right, was already loaded and aimed and recording. There was nothing left to lose by trying. There was only the machine and the slope, and the question that had been waiting in the coal barn for 3 years and waiting in his chest for 1 whole year since the morning he set the firewood down. He turned and walked toward the Diamond T, slow and careful, an old man and an old machine alone against a mountain that the modern world had already declared impossible. He put his hand on the cold steel of the door, and he stopped, and for just a moment, with his back to all of them, Earl Halvorsen asked himself the only question that mattered. He had come up this mountain telling Roy Maddox he was here to save a stuck Kenworth. But standing in the snow with his hand on the door of his father's machine, the camera recording the whole valley, watching the old man, was no longer entirely sure whether he had driven up Lolo Ridge to save that truck, or to find out before it was too late whether there was anything left in him worth saving. He opened the door, and he climbed up into the cab, and the mountain waited. Earl Halvorsen settled into the cold steel seat of the Diamond T, and the moment the door closed behind him, the laughing on the slope died into something else, and a man near the back of the crowd quietly bet another man $20 that the old truck would be lying at the bottom of the canyon before the sun went down. The bet was not cruel, it was just honest. Every man on that ridge had spent his life around heavy iron, and every instinct they owned told them the same thing. You do not send a 50-year-old machine and a 76-year-old man up a grade that has already beaten $400,000 of modern steel. The mountain did not care about history. Gravity did not read newsreels. But Earl did not start the pull, not yet. He sat in the cab a long moment with his hands on the wheel, and then he climbed back down slow and deliberate, and he began to walk the slope, up to the buried Kenworth and back, side to side across the grade. He crouched and pressed his bare hand flat against the frozen mud and held it there, reading the ground the way another man might read a letter. He dug his fingers into the snow at the base of three different trees, testing the soil, feeling for the difference between dirt that would hold and dirt that would let go. The crew watched him do it and did not understand that the work had already begun. To them, it looked like an old man wandering in the snow. To Earl, it was the most important part of the whole job. The part you could not rush, the part that decided whether everyone went home tonight or whether they did not. While he read the ground, his mind went somewhere else, the way an old man's mind does when his hands are busy. It went back 51 years to another cold morning, to the first time he ever saw the machine he was now standing beside. His father had brought her home in the spring of 1947. Earl Halvorsen had come over from Norway with nothing but a back strong enough to log, and he had been cutting timber in the Bitterroots since the 1920s. And when the war ended and the army began selling off its equipment by the trainload, Nils had driven all the way to a military depot in Washington state with $1,400 folded in his shirt pocket. He came home with a tank recovery vehicle. That was what she was. Not a tow truck, not a wrecker for hauling cars out of ditches. The Diamond T had been built under Army contract to go into combat zones and drag 30-ton Sherman tanks out of the mud of Europe, off bombed roads up the mountain passes of Italy and France while the artillery came down. The army had ordered hundreds of them, and when the fighting stopped, they sold them cheap to men like Nils, who looked at a machine designed to recover tanks under fire and saw a machine that could pull a logging truck off any slope God ever tilted. Earl had been 25 years old that spring. He could still remember the first time his father let him sit in the cab while she pulled the deep, slow grind of her, the way she did not strain and did not hurry, the way she simply took up the load and walked it home, no matter how the slope argued. He remembered his father's hands on the controls, big scarred Norwegian hands, and the way Nils would talk to the machine in his old country accent, low and steady, as if she could hear him. His father had bought her from a quartermaster sergeant who had ridden in one of her sisters across half of Italy, and the sergeant had told Nils things while they did the paperwork that Nils had carried home and told Earl across more winters than Earl could count. How the recovery crews went out at night behind the lines and sometimes ahead of them to bring back the tanks that had thrown a track or slid off a mountain road or bogged down in a flooded field. How a machine like this one had pulled a Sherman up a grade outside Casino with the snow coming sideways and the guns walking up the valley toward them. And the crew had kept pulling because the men inside that tank were alive and waiting. How she never rushed and never quit. How she was built by men who understood that the work that mattered most was the work everyone else had already given up on. Earl had grown up on those stories the way other boys grew up on scripture, and somewhere along the way they had stopped being stories about a war and become stories about how a man was supposed to live. You went where the others would not go. You did not quit on a thing that was still alive and waiting. You did not rush, and you did not charge a neighbor, and you kept the iron running for the day the impossible work came back. Nils used her for 30 years until the day he died in 1976, and he had a rule about her that he repeated so often Earl could still hear it. She was built to go where the regular machines could not reach. So that was where you took her. And you did not always charge a man for it because a man stuck on a mountain was not a customer. He was a neighbor. Earl came back to himself, standing in the snow, with his hand flat on the frozen ground, 51 years older than the boy in the cab, and he had found what he was looking for. The firmest line up the slope, the place to set her. The trees upslope strong enough to anchor against, and the one tree a big leaning fir set back from the edge that looked strong, but that he did not quite trust and could not say why. He had it. He stood up, and his old knees complained, and he started back toward the Diamond T to begin. That was when the green pickup came tearing up the access road too fast for the ice. It slid to a stop at an angle, and a young man got out before it had fully stopped moving, and he came across the snow toward Earl with his face white and his jaw set, and every man on the ridge could see the family in him before he said a word. He had the old man's height and the old man's frame, 30 years younger and twice as frightened. His name was Cole Halvorsen, and he was Earl's grandson, and he had driven up from Hamilton the second a logging hand called his mother and told her where the old man had gone. "No," Cole said. "No, get down from there." Earl kept walking toward the cab. "Cole, I mean it." Cole got in front of him, put a hand flat on his grandfather's chest, gentle and desperate at the same time. "You are not doing this. You promised. We all sat in that kitchen, and you promised." "I did not promise. The rest of you decided. There is a difference." "Grandpa." Cole's voice broke on the word, and he glanced around at the watching men and lowered it, ashamed to be doing this in front of them, but more afraid not to. "Last spring, you remember last spring? You sat down on the porch step, and you could not get up for 10 minutes. The doctor said, he said any heavy strain. He used the word fatal. Do you understand that I drove up here so I would not have to be the one to call my mother and tell her you died on a mountain trying to prove something to a man with a camera?" The whole site had gone quiet. Wade Renner stood with the camcorder lowered now, not recording because some things a man does not record. Travis Beck looked away. This was no longer about a stuck truck. This was a grandson trying to keep his grandfather alive out loud in the cold in front of strangers. And for the first time, Earl Halvorsen let them all see the fear. It moved across his weathered face the way a cloud shadow moves across a field. And for one moment, he looked exactly as old as he was, and exactly as tired, and exactly as scared as Cole needed him not to be. He reached up and took his grandson's wrist, and he held it, and when he spoke, his voice was low, and only for the two of them, though the silence carried it. "You think I do not feel it," Earl said. "I feel it every morning, Cole. I felt it walking up this slope an hour ago. That thing in my chest telling me to sit down. Telling me I am done." He tightened his grip on the boy's wrist. "But I will tell you what I have learned about being done. The day they sat me in that kitchen and decided it for me with their soft voices, I did not feel safe. I felt buried. They put me in the ground a year early and called it caring." He looked up the slope at the wrecked Kenworth, at the young driver standing alone beside the only thing he owned. "There is a man up here who is going to lose everything today, unless somebody who knows how does something about it. And I am the only one on this mountain who knows how. If I climb down off this machine now and drive home, then you are right, the strain will not kill me." He looked back at Cole. "But I will have died last spring after all. I just will not have noticed yet." Cole stood there with his grandfather's hand around his wrist and his eyes wet in the cold. He thought about his own father, Earl's son, dead 9 years now, in a mill accident that the family still did not talk about, and he understood for the first time that he had been trying to hold on to the last Halvorsen man he had by locking him in a kitchen, and that the locking was its own kind of killing. He had come to save the old man's body. He had not understood until this exact moment that the old man's body was not the only thing on this mountain that could die today. And there was something else harder to look at that came to him in that frozen second. For a year, he had told himself that keeping his grandfather safe was love. He had believed it completely. But standing here with the old man's hand around his wrist and the old man's eyes telling him the truth, Cole understood that some of it had been fear, his own fear dressed up as care. He had not been able to bear losing another one. So he had tried to put the old man somewhere. The loss could not reach him. A kitchen, a chair, a blanket, and he had called the cage kindness and never once asked the man in it what he wanted. His grandfather had asked him a question without words up on that slope, and the question was whether Cole loved him enough to let him be who he was, even if who he was might cost them both. It was the hardest question anyone had ever put to him, and he was 28 years old, and he answered it the only way a man can answer it and still call himself a man. He let go of his grandfather's chest. "Then I am not leaving," Cole said. "If you are doing this, I am up here with you. You are going to need a second pair of hands, and I am not letting them be anyone else's." Something passed between them then that did not need words, the old kind, the kind that runs down through fathers and sons and skips along the bloodline like current down a wire. Earl nodded once, and just like that, the grandson who had come to stop the work became the only assistant the work would have. "All right," Earl said, "then you do exactly what I tell you when I tell you, and not one thing more. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." "Then come on, we have got rigging to do and the light is already turning." The rigging took 90 minutes, and Earl did not hurry a single second of it. He brought the diamond T around and set her on the firmest ground he had found 150 feet downslope of the buried Kenworth Square and level as the grade would allow. Then he and Cole went to work with the cable. It was old cable, military cable, thicker than anything the modern outfits ran, stamped along its length with the faded markings of the United States Army. Earl ran it up the slope and through a pair of heavy steel snatch blocks, and he had Cole climb the grade above them to set the upper block, chaining it around the base of the strongest tree he could reach. What the blocks did was simple and old and beautiful. They turned one line into three. Every foot the winch pulled in the load only moved a third of that, but it moved with 3 times the force, and the angle of the pull stayed where Earl wanted it instead of fighting him. He was not going to overpower this mountain. He was going to outsmart it the way his father had taught him, the way the men who built her had figured out 50 years before any of this. Then he hooked the cable to the frame of the Kenworth at a point he chose with great care, low and forward, so that when the line came tight, it would not simply drag the truck through the frozen mud. It would lift the nose and shift the great dead weight forward into the front axles, where there was firmer ground and better grip waiting, and only then begin to walk it up the slope. "Not that tree," Earl called up a Cole who had started toward the big leaning fir. "The one to your left, the straight one. This one is bigger. Bigger is not the same as stronger. That big one leans for a reason, and I do not know the reason. Take the straight one." Cole did the climbing, because the climbing was the young man's work and the choosing was the old man's. The boy went up the grade and set the blocks where his grandfather pointed and came back down and went up again, and in the going up and coming down a thing was built between them that was stronger than the cable. They did not talk much. They did not need to. Earl would lift 2 fingers and Cole would understand, and somewhere in the second hour the grandson stopped being afraid and started being proud, and the change in him was visible from across the slope. Once handing his grandfather a shackle, Cole said quietly, "Dad would have liked to see this." And Earl took the shackle and did not answer for a moment, and then he said, "Your dad set chokers for me when he was younger than you. He had good hands. You have got his hands. It was the most they had said about the dead man in 9 years, and they said it bent over a cable on a frozen slope, and somehow that was the only place it could have been said. There was a way Earl set each block that Cole would remember the rest of his life. Though at the time he could not have said what made it different, the old man never forced anything. He would offer a chain, a turn around the trunk, and then stand back and look at the whole shape of it, the line from the truck to the block to the winch, the way the angles wanted to fold, and only then would he commit. He worked the way a man plays a long game of checkers against an opponent. He respects thinking 3 moves past the move in front of him, asking at every step not, can I do this, but what does this make the mountain do next? Cole had spent his whole life thinking of his grandfather as a strong man, a man who moved heavy things. Up on that slope, he understood for the first time that the strength had never been the point. The strength was just the cost of admission. The thing that made Earl Halvorsen what he was had always been the thinking, the patience, the refusal to mistake hurry for progress, and you could not see that from a kitchen. And the family had spent a year deciding the old man was finished without ever once watching him do the only thing that showed who he really was. Danny Pruitt watched the whole thing with his arms crossed and his patience draining away by the minute, and finally he could not hold it anymore. 90 minutes, Danny said loud enough to carry. 90 minutes to hang some cable. We could have had the rotator broken down and on the lowboy by now. This is not recovery. This is an old man putting on a show before he gives up and goes home. He had said it to the crew, but he had said it for Wade, expecting the boss to agree, the way the boss always agreed because the boss owned the rotator, and the rotator was the gospel. But Wade Renner had spent the last hour watching an old man read the ground with his bare hand, and watching a grandson go from terror to pride, and watching a 50-year-old machine sit patient and certain in the cold, and somewhere in that hour something in Wade had quietly changed sides without telling him. The man with the $400,000 machine had been laughed off this mountain by Kurt Lang on an open radio. The man with the clipboard was at the bottom of the road writing the word total, and the only person up here who seemed to believe a thing could still be done was a 76-year-old logger with Army surplus iron. Danny, Wade said without turning around. Shut your mouth and watch. Danny blinked. Boss, I am only saying the numbers do not. I heard your numbers. Wade turned now, and there was something raw in his face that Danny had never seen there before. I have been listening to numbers for 2 days. The numbers say it cannot be done. The other companies had numbers too. Everybody on this mountain has numbers. He looked up the slope at the old man in the old machine. That man does not have numbers. He has 55 years. So we are going to stand here and we are going to be quiet and we are going to watch a man who knows more than we do. Is that clear? It was not a question, and Danny did not answer it, and he turned his face away with the particular anger of a young man who suspects he is about to be proven wrong and is not ready to forgive the world for it. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than before. Up on the slope, Earl was nearly ready. He made one last walk along the cable to check every block and every chain the way his father had taught him to check, because the day you stop checking is the day the cable finds the one thing you missed. And it was on that walk, with his hand running lightly along the line, that his fingers stopped. There, near the lower block where the cable had lain coiled in the barn for 3 years, and then been dragged across rock this morning as a place where the steel had begun to fray. A strand had broken and curled back on itself, a small bright wound in the dark metal, no longer than a thumb. To most men it would have meant nothing. To Earl it meant the difference between a cable that held and a cable that let go under full load and came whipping back through the air fast enough to cut a man in half. He crouched over it, And for the second time that day, the old man hesitated. He had felt it during the heart attack talk that he might fail. Now he held the proof of it in his hand. The plan he had built was 150 feet of perfect geometry, and there was a wound in it, and he did not have another cable, and the light was going, and the man with the clipboard was waiting at the bottom of the road for exactly this, for the old fool's machine to come up short. Danny saw him crouch over the line and called up the slope, the sneer back in his voice, now that Wade had turned away. Problem with the antique. Earl did not answer him. He knelt in the snow with the frayed cable in his hands, and he thought slow and steady the way he had been taught to think when everything in him wanted to hurry. And then he did the thing that 55 years had taught him and no school ever could. He did not need a new cable. He needed the wound out of the load path. So he loosened the line and reversed it, fed the cable through the blocks the other way around. Sacrificing 30 feet of length he could afford to lose until the frayed section lay slack and harmless on the downhill side, carrying nothing. And the good steel, the strong steel, lay where the full weight of the world was about to come down on it. It took him 15 minutes. Danny watched it the whole time and slowly stopped sneering, because even a man who believed only in numbers could see that he was watching something that was not in any book. He was watching a man turn a disaster into a decision calmly with cold hands in front of a camera with a bad heart at 76 years old. Cole watched too from up the slope, and he saw the thing his grandfather did not say out loud, which was that the old man had caught with his bare fingers the one flaw that would have killed them all, and he had caught it because he had checked when he was tired and afraid and could have told himself it was good enough. When Earl stood up, the fear had gone somewhere small and quiet. It was still there. It would always be there now, but it had stopped giving orders. He walked back to the Diamond T. He stopped at the door and looked at his grandson. Cole, when she takes the load, you stand clear. All the way clear down past the rear of her where the cable cannot reach you if it goes. You understand me. Whatever happens up here, you do not come toward this machine. Promise me that one, since I would not give you the other. Cole's jaw worked. I promise. Say it like you mean it. Say it like your mother is listening. I promise, Grandpa, I will stand clear. Earl reached up and gripped the cold steel of the cab and pulled himself in one careful motion. At a time, an old body doing a young body's work because there was no one else to do it. The cab was open to the weather, no doors, no heater, nothing but a roof and a windshield between the man and the mountain. It was 24 degrees on that slope, and the wind came straight through, and Earl Halvorsen did not seem to feel it. He had stopped feeling the cold somewhere around 1955. The cold was just one more thing the soft voices worried about that he had outlived. He set his hands on the controls. The crew below went still. Travis Beck took one step forward and stopped. Cole moved down the slope to where his grandfather had told him to stand and could not make himself look away. Wade Renner raised the camcorder again, but slowly now, almost gently, the way you raise a thing you suddenly want to remember, instead of a thing you want as evidence. Earl put her in the lowest gear. She had the gear with so much mechanical reduction that she could pull a mountain at the speed of a man walking while the engine never rose above an idle, and he eased the throttle in and the winch drum began to turn. The cable came up off the ground. The slack ran out of it foot by foot, and then the line went bar tight as a struck string humming faintly in the cold air. And 150 feet up the slope, 65 tons of truck and timber took the strain. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. The cable hummed. The Diamond T ground forward at the pace of a slow walk, and the engine barely lifted its voice, and the boom took the load and held it, and nothing moved. The Kenworth sat exactly where it had sat for 3 days, dead and buried and immovable, And on the slope below, the men who had bet against the old truck began in their hearts to feel the weight of being right. 35 seconds, 40. Cole stopped breathing. Danny's mouth had gone dry. Wade held the camera so tight his knuckles ached. And then the rear of the Kenworth lifted, not far, 2 inches. 2 inches of 65 tons rising up out of frozen mud as the great dead weight began for the first time in 3 days to shift. The cable did not snap. The boom did not fail. The old machine did not slide. She simply took the impossible thing and moved it 2 inches and then held it there, patient, certain, asking the mountain a question the mountain had not been asked in 50 years. And in that exact instant, with the whole valley watching and the camera running and his grandson finally beginning to breathe again, Earl Halvorsen heard a sound come up from the slope behind him that did not belong. A deep groaning crack from the direction of the upper anchor, the sound of a tree taking more than a tree was ever meant to take. The crack came down the slope like a rifle shot, and then the Diamond T moved the wrong way. She slid. Not far, a foot, maybe 2, the whole 22,000 pounds of her dropping backward and sideways toward the edge, where the slope fell away into the canyon, and the cable that had been barred tight a second ago went slack and then snapped taut again with a sound like the mountain clearing its throat. Up the grade, the big leaning fir, the one Earl had not trusted, the one Cole had set the block on anyway, when he ran the line through the upper position, was leaning harder now, its roots tearing slowly out of 6 feet of frozen overburden, and every man on the ridge understood in the same instant that the upper anchor was failing and the old machine was going to follow it over the side. "I knew it!" Danny Pruitt shouted, and his voice cracked in the cold. "I told you, I told all of you the vector load was always going to take her. She is going over." Cole was already running. He came up the slope toward the cab with no thought in his head but the one his grandfather had made him promise against his boots, slipping on the frozen mud, his arms already reaching for the door to drag the old man out before the whole thing went into the canyon. It did not matter that he had promised. It did not matter that his mother was listening in his memory. He had already lost his father to a machine on a bad day, and he was not going to stand clear and watch the mountain take the last of them. "Grandpa, get out, get out. Stay back!" Earl's voice came down off that machine like the voice of a younger man, like 50 years of command compressed into 2 words, and it hit Cole hard enough to stop him 10 feet short of the cab. "Do not come near her. You promised me. Stand clear." And then, while every instinct in every man on that mountain screamed to let go, to dump the load, to save what could be saved, Earl Halvorsen did the one thing none of them expected. He did not let go. He held the throttle exactly where it was. He kept the tension on. Because Earl had felt the slide in the seat of his pants the way a horseman feels a stumble, and he had understood it faster than fear could, the way a man understands a thing when he has spent 55 years feeling machines through the soles of his boots. The slide was not the end. The slide was the load finding its true line. If he dumped the tension now, the slack would let that leaning tree spring back, and the whole rigging would crack apart, and then she really would go over. The only way out was through. The only safe place was forward into the pole, not away from it. So he held. He held while the tree groaned. He held while his grandson stood frozen 10 feet away with his hands out. He held while the Diamond T trembled on the lip of the canyon, and the cable screamed, and his own heart slammed against the warning the doctors had given him, slammed so hard he saw white at the edges of his vision and tasted copper, and did not take his hand off the throttle. He held, and he fed her one more breath of throttle, and he steered the whole machine forward into the very thing everyone else was running from. And the leaning tree stopped leaning. The root ball had torn back through the soft overburden, until it caught deep down on the thing the other companies had said you would have to anchor to and could never reach. Bedrock. The roots wrapped a buried shelf of solid mountain stone and locked, and the anchor that had been failing a second ago was suddenly the strongest point on the whole slope, and the Diamond T quit sliding and sat down hard on her own weight and held. The silence afterward was enormous. Danny Pruitt stood with his mouth open and the words I told you still hanging in the air, and they were the wrong words now, completely and publicly wrong, because the old man had not gone over the side. The old man had felt the failure coming and steered into it and turned it into the anchor that saved him. The numbers had said one thing, the 55 years had said another, and the 55 years had been right. But it was not over, and Earl knew it was not over, and that was when the second crisis came up the slope on two clean boots. Glenn Forsythe had heard the crack from the bottom of the access road and come up at a run, and now he stood at the edge of the work zone with his clipboard clutched to his chest and his tidy face white with something that was part fear and part fury. "That is enough," Glenn shouted. "Stop! Stop this right now. I just watched that machine nearly go into the canyon. I am not going to stand here and watch a man die. Mr. Renner, you shut this down this instant, or I will write up this entire site as a willful safety violation, and there will not be $1 of coverage for any of it. Do you hear me? Not the truck, not the timber, not one." "Glenn." Wade Renner's voice was quiet, and it cut straight through the adjusters the way quiet sometimes does. "Be quiet." Glenn turned astonished. "Renner, I am trying to protect You are trying to protect a number on a form." Wade lowered the camcorder. For 2 days, this man with the clipboard had stood at the bottom of his mountain and made him feel like a failure. And for 2 days, Wade had taken it because the man with the clipboard held the money and the money was the gospel. But Wade had just watched something he had no number for, and the gospel had changed. You came up here early so you could write it off easy on Monday. You decided that truck was dead before you ever looked at it. Well, it is not dead. There is a man up there doing the thing my $400,000 machine could not do, and you are not going to take it from him with a pen. Wade took a step toward the adjuster. You want to write up a violation, you write up mine. It is my site. But you are going to stand here, and you are going to watch him finish, because so help me, Glenn, this is the realest thing either one of us is ever going to see. And you are not going to miss it hiding behind a clipboard. Glenn Forsythe stood there with his mouth working and no sound coming out. He looked at the clipboard in his hands, the forms, the columns, the tidy little boxes where a man's whole life got reduced to a salvage figure, and for the first time in 20 years of doing this, he felt ashamed of them. Slowly, slowly, he lowered the clipboard to his side. He did not say yes. He did not have to. He just turned and looked up the slope at the old man and the old machine, and for the first time in his clean, careful life, he watched instead of measured. Up in the cab, Earl had heard none of it. He had room in his mind for one thing only, and that thing was the slope. The slide had cost him. The geometry he had built so carefully was off now. The angle wrong, the perfect line broken by 2 feet of mountain. A younger man, a prouder man, might have tried to pull anyway and forced it. Earl shut the winch down instead. He set the brake. He sat for a moment with his hand pressed flat against the center of his own chest, waiting to see what his heart would do. And when it settled back into something like a rhythm, he climbed down out of the cab into the cold. And without a word to anyone, he went back to the cable and the blocks and began to rig the whole thing again from the new reality the mountain had handed him. He did not explain it. There was nothing to explain that the slope had not already said. He moved the upper block to the leaning fir that had found bedrock, the strongest point, Now the failure itself had revealed the very tree he had not trusted, which had turned out to be the only one that reached deep enough to save them. He reset the angle to account for where the Kenworth sat now, instead of where it had sat 10 minutes ago. Cole worked beside him in silence, white-faced, shaken, doing exactly what his grandfather pointed at, and nothing more. And the work that had taken 90 minutes the first time took 20, the second because the second time the old man was not guessing. The mountain had shown him its hand. "You disobeyed me," Earl said quietly, not looking up from the shackle he was setting. "I know. You came toward the machine." "I know, Grandpa." Earl was quiet a moment. "Your father would have done the same thing." He set the shackle and tested it with a hard pull. "Does not make it right, but I understand it. Now get back down the slope, and this time stay there, because if I have to worry about you, I cannot do this. And if I cannot do this, that man loses his truck. You hear me? Your standing clear is part of the rigging. It is the most important part." Cole looked at him and understood that his grandfather had just handed him a job instead of a scolding, and that the job was the only apology either of them needed. He went back down the slope, and this time he stayed. When it was done, Earl climbed back into the cab, and he did not hesitate at the door this time. There was no fear left to manage. The worst thing had already happened, and he had ridden it down and come up alive and right. Whatever the slope had left to throw, he had already met its hardest pitch and held. He put her in the low gear and he eased the throttle in, and this time when the cable came tight, the whole world had changed. She took the load and the Kenworth moved, not 2 inches. It came slow and grinding, and sure, the great dead weight lifting onto its nose and shifting forward onto the firmer ground exactly as Earl had built it to, and the Diamond T walked it up the mountain at the pace of an old man, walking the engine, never raising its voice. The winch turning with the patient, relentless certainty of a machine doing the precise thing it had been made to do half a century before. Pull, hold, let the load settle. Pull, hold, let the load settle. There was a rhythm to it, slow and deep and almost holy, and the men on the slope fell into watching it the way men watch a fire. Inside the open cab, Earl felt every inch of it through his hands and through the seat and through the soles of his boots, the way he had felt his father's pulls when he was a boy, and he found that he was not cold and he was not afraid, and the iron band across his chest had loosened into something that was almost peace. He was doing the one thing on this earth he had been made to do, and his hands still knew how. And that knowledge was worth every year the doctor said he had left and every year they said he did not. He listened to her the way his father had taught him to listen, not to the noise of her, but to the meaning underneath the noise, the small changes in the grind that told you when the load was lifting and when it was dragging, and when to give her a breath more and when to wait. Every time he gave her throttle, he gave it the way you ease into a handshake, not the way you throw a punch. Every time the cable took a new bite of the slope, he stopped and let the whole system find its rest before he asked for another inch. He was not fighting the mountain. He had never once, in 55 years, won a fight against a mountain, and he had buried men who tried. He was asking and waiting and asking again, and the mountain, inch by frozen inch, was beginning to answer. Travis Beck stood at the front of the crowd, now with his hands pressed over his mouth. Danny Pruitt watched without a word, his clipboard hanging forgotten at his side. And somewhere in those minutes, the young man stopped watching to see whether the old man would fail and started watching to learn how he was succeeding, which is a different thing entirely, and the difference would shape the rest of Danny's life. Glenn Forsythe watched the clipboard still down at his side. Roy Maddox watched with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose faith was being repaid in front of everyone who had doubted it. Wade Renner watched through the small glass eye of the camcorder, and behind the camera, his face was wet and he did not wipe it. 20 minutes in the front wheels of the Kenworth rolled up onto firm ground and bit. 35 minutes in the buried rear tandems broke free of the frozen mud all at once, with a deep, wet sound like a cork drawn from a bottle, a sound that rolled down the slope and made every man there flinch and then grin. And 50 minutes in the fully loaded logging truck stood on flat, solid ground at the top of the grade, 65 tons of it engine, cold but whole, every chain still tight, every log still on the bed, ready to be driven down the mountain to the mill it had been trying to reach for 3 days. For a moment, nobody moved, and then Travis Beck made a sound that was not a word, a raw, broken sound torn up out of a young man who had spent 3 nights sleeping in a truck beside the only thing he owned. And he sat down right there in the snow and put his face in his hands and wept, because the thing he had given up for dead was alive. And his whole life, his wife and the baby coming in the spring, and the bank papers in the future. He thought he had thrown off a mountain, had been handed back to him by an old man he had never met. Earl shut the winch down. He set the brake. He climbed out of the cab, slow and careful, one deliberate motion at a time, and he began to coil the cable with the same unhurried patience he had used to lay it out. An old man putting his tools away, as if he had not just done a thing, $400,000 and 4 companies, and the laws of the modern world had all declared impossible. Travis got up out of the snow and came to him, wiping his face, not ashamed of the tears anymore. And he tried 3 times to say something and could not. And finally, he just took the old man's hand in both of his and held it. Earl looked at the young man and the wedding band on the hand gripping his, and he understood the whole shape of it without being told. "Go home," Earl said gently. "Go home to your wife. That is all the thanks I want. You go home tonight and you hold on to what you almost lost." Travis nodded, unable to speak, and went down the mountain to call his wife. He would tell that story for the rest of his life. He would tell it to the baby that was born that spring, when the baby was old enough to understand, and then he would tell it again when she was older. Still the story of the 3 days he sat in the dark at the bottom of a mountain, certain he had thrown away her whole future, and the old man he had never met who fired up a machine older than the war, and drove up out of nowhere and handed it all back. He would name no price he was ever asked to pay because there was none. He would only ever be told by a man he met for one afternoon to go home and hold on to what he almost lost. And he did. For the rest of his life he did. Wade Renner walked up the slope to him. He had set the camera down somewhere. He stood in front of the old man for a long moment and could not find the beginning of what he needed to say. "How much?" Wade finally managed. "How much do I owe you?" Earl kept coiling the cable. "Nothing." "Earl," Wade's voice cracked, "you did what my machine could not do, in front of all of them. After I pointed a camera at you and told you I wanted it on tape when you failed. That is not nothing. That cannot be nothing." Earl looped the last of the cable and hung it on the hook and turned to face the younger man. And when he spoke, it was not unkind and it was not proud, and it carried something in it that had been waiting 51 years to be said out loud on this mountain. "My father bought this machine in 1947 to go where the regular outfits could not reach. That was the whole reason he wanted her." He looked at the diamond T at the faded red over the old army green. "He used to say a man stuck on a mountain is not a customer. He is a neighbor, and you do not send a neighbor a bill for getting him off a mountain." Earl looked back at Wade, and something in his weathered face had gone very quiet and very peaceful. "I did not come up here for your money, son. I came up here because they told me last spring that I was done, put me in a kitchen, and decided it for me. And I needed to know before it was too late to find out whether there was anything left in her. He laid his hand on the cold steel of the fender one more time. Whether there was anything left in either one of us. Now I know. That is worth more than anything in your checkbook. Wade Renner put out his hand, and the old man took it, and the grip that passed between them was the grip of two men who would understand each other for the rest of their lives. I will not forget this, Wade said. As long as I live, I will not forget what I watched up here today. Cole came down off the slope, then his grandfather's grandson, and he did not say anything either. He just walked up and put his arms around the old man and held on the way. You hold on to someone you almost lost twice in one afternoon, and Earl held him back, and over the boy's shoulder, the old man closed his eyes for a moment in the cold. There was one more thing. Danny Pruitt came over slow, his certainty all gone out of him, and he stood in front of Earl with the look of a young man who has had the floor of his whole understanding pulled out from under him. Sir, Danny said, I owe you an apology. The numbers I ran, the things I said. You were not wrong, son. Earl said it gently and he meant it, and that gentleness was the last thing Danny had expected, and the thing that undid him completely. Your numbers were good numbers. The vector load was real. Everything you said about it was true. The old man almost smiled. You just figured the wrong road. You ran the math on overpowering the mountain. You never ran it on working with her. That is not something they could have taught you in 2 years. That is something the mountain has to teach you, and she only teaches it slow, and she charges a hard price for every lesson. He put his weathered hand on the young man's shoulder. You keep running your numbers, Danny. The numbers matter. Just remember there is a man inside the machine, and the man knows things the numbers do not. You have got time to learn the rest. I had 55 years. You are just getting started. Danny Pruitt nodded and could not speak and looked at the ground. He would carry those words the rest of his career, and he would say them to young men of his own one day, and he would always credit them to an old logger he met on a mountain for one afternoon. Earl Halvorsen climbed back into the Diamond T. The engine coughed once and caught and settled into its low grinding idle, and he backed her around and pointed her down the access road, and he drove away down the mountain at 15 miles an hour with the boom swaying gently behind the cab, and the whole sight stood in the snow and watched him go until the sound of her faded into the trees. But the story does not end on that mountain. Roy Maddox got his contract delivered, and the 40 men kept their winter. And Roy told the story in every diner and every equipment yard and every tavern in the valley, the story of the 76-year-old logger who pulled off Lolo Ridge, what no modern outfit would even attempt. The story traveled the way the best stories travel in mountain country, slow and sure, and gathering weight, and over the next 6 years the calls came. 9 of them. Always the same kind of job, a steep slope, bad ground, a situation where the modern machines were too heavy or too cautious to risk. There was a fuel truck off a switchback near Sula that 2 outfits had walked away from. There was a dozer in a creek bottom in the spring melt that everyone said would have to be left until summer. There was a school bus empty, thank God, that had slid backward off an icy turnout above a drop that made strong men sick to look at. And Earl had pulled it up so gently that the driver who watched said afterward, it looked less like a recovery than like the mountain handing the bus back. Earl never advertised. He never raised a rate he did not charge. He often took no money at all the way his father had taught him, and the Diamond T became known through the Bitterroots by a name the loggers gave her. The War Wrecker, the machine you called when the new companies said it could not be done. And on every one of those 9 jobs, there was a younger man riding along in the cab beside him learning. Cole had stopped trying to keep his grandfather out of the machine. Instead, he had climbed in with him. He learned to read the ground with his bare hand. He learned to check the cable when he was tired. He learned that bigger was not the same as stronger, and that the only safe way out of a slide was sometimes straight into it, and that you did not send a neighbor a bill. He learned the things that were not in any book in the only school that taught them, in the years he had almost thrown away by trying to lock the teacher in a kitchen. There was an evening after the bus when the two of them sat on the tailgate of Cole's pickup in the last light with the war wrecker cooling beside them, and Cole finally asked the question he'd been carrying since the first day on Lolo Ridge. He asked his grandfather if he was ever afraid up there with the heart and the slope and all of it. And Earl was quiet a while, and then he said that he was afraid every single time, that the fear never once left him in 55 years, and that any man who told you he worked these mountains without fear was either lying or already dead. The trick, Earl said, was not to get rid of the fear. The trick was to stop letting it drive. You kept it in the cab with you where you could see it, and you did the work anyway, and slowly it learned to ride quiet. That, the old man said, was the only thing he knew that was worth passing down. And it had taken him until he was 76 and supposed to be finished to learn that it was the only thing he had ever really been teaching. Cole did not say anything. He just sat with it the way you sit with something you know you will be unpacking for the rest of your life. Earl Halvorsen worked until he was too old to climb into the cab, and then he stopped on his own terms, in his own time, no kitchen and no soft voices deciding it for him. He died in the spring of 2004, 82 years old, 6 years and a whole second life. After the morning, his heart first warned him in his own bed with his grandson holding his hand. The diamond tea went to Cole, and Cole, who had driven up Lolo Ridge that February morning to stop the whole thing and stayed to become a part of it, kept his grandfather's machine alive for years, started her up, ran her easy, honored the work, the way a man honors a thing handed down. And when the time came that he could no longer give her what she needed, he did not let her rust in a barn. He gave her to the Military Heritage Museum at Fort Missoula, where she sits today fully restored, the faded red gone and the honest army green brought back with a placard beside her that tells the whole history, the depot in Washington, the tanks in Italy, and the February morning on a Montana logging road, when she pulled a thing off a mountain that defeated everything modern men had brought against it. The placard carries a quote. It came from Wade Renner, who spent the last years of his life as the loudest voice telling Earl Halvorsen's story to anyone who would listen. I spent 20 years believing that newer meant better, and that the most expensive machine on the site was the best machine on the site. An old logger and a piece of Army surplus iron taught me that the question was never how new a thing is or what it cost. The question is whether it was built for the work you are asking it to do, and whether the hands running it know the difference. I have never been so glad to be so wrong. There were two more things that nobody up on that ridge would have predicted. Glenn Forsyth, the adjuster who came up that mountain to write a truck off as a total loss, drove down it a different man. He never forgot what he watched from behind that clipboard the moment he stopped measuring and started seeing. He approved Travis Beck's claim in full. That Monday found a line in the policy nobody had bothered to read closely, and made sure a young man with a baby coming kept the truck that was the whole of his future. Years later, when he retired from the insurance business, he put his own money into a small scholarship fund for young people going into heavy recovery and equipment work in western Montana, and he named it after Earl Halvorsen. And the first thing every recipient was asked to do was sit down and listen to the story of an old man who held the throttle when every number on earth told him to let go. And Wade Renner kept the tape. The camcorder footage he had shot to prove the old man would fail, He kept it in his office at High Divide for the rest of his career, and he never let a new hire start work without sitting them down to watch it first. Every young operator who ever came through that company began the same way in a chair in front of an old television, watching a 50-year-old wrecker walk 65 tons up a frozen Montana slope at the speed of a man walking, while an old man who had been told he was finished proved the whole modern world wrong without ever once raising his voice. Wade made his peace with Kurt Lang at a funeral a few years on the way old rivals do when there are fewer of them left each year, and he told Kurt the whole story, and Kurt listened without a single joke. And at the end of it, the hard old competitor was quiet for a long time, and then said, "Only I wish I had stayed to see it." So did every man who drove away. The tow company said it was impossible. The other outfits said it was impossible. The numbers said it was impossible. The war wrecker pulled anyway. And 51 years of Army surplus iron in the hands of an old man with one warning from his own heart and nothing left to prove to anyone but himself, defeated 2 days of modern failure on a mountainside where gravity itself should have won. Some things are not built to be replaced. They are only built to be honored and kept running and trusted on the day the impossible word comes back around. The men are like that too. We are too quick, all of us, to decide a thing is finished. We look at the gray paint and the worn places and the year stamped on the frame, and we put it in a barn, and we tell ourselves we are being kind. But there is a difference between a thing that is finished and a thing that is only resting between the jobs it was made for, and the difference cannot be read off a spec sheet or a doctor's chart. It can only be found out the hard way on a cold slope when the work that nobody else will touch comes looking for the one machine and the one man still built to do it. And if you are lucky just once in your life, you get to stand on a cold mountain and watch one of them remind the whole world what they were made for. You get to see the gray old iron take up a load that defeated everything newer and louder and more expensive and walk it home at the speed of a man walking without ever once raising its voice. And if you are luckier still, you get to be the young man standing clear at the bottom of the slope, watching, learning, beginning to understand that the things worth knowing are almost never the things they can teach you in 2 years, and that the old men in the barns are not finished at all. They are just waiting to be asked.